Hi, I'm Justin Moorman.
And I'm Katie Thornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social-emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life. All right, welcome back to the podcast. Our next episode, Discipline Reform, with our guest, Guy Stevens. We are super excited to have him on per our normal setup now. I guess This is our normal setup now when we have guests. We're gonna have Katie go ahead and introduce him.
I love it.
Katie's best way, and then we will kind of get started.
Yeah, this is it's my introduction for Guy based on Katie. So here's why.
So anything she says wrong, Guy, you just jump in and correct her. Yeah.
Yeah. So because I've been following.
If it's better, we'll leave it. So
Okay. This might be your new permanent bio. I've been following Guy's work for several years now. I think if you're in the trauma-informed community, you know who Guy Stevens is. Guy is a parent and an advocate, so I love Guy's story because it really comes from the heart of being a parent first, and then an advocate based upon his own journey. And then he's really devoted his life's work on reforming and creating more humane educational systems through educational neuroscience and best practices and educating others. I love that Guy's not only an advocate, but he comes back with solutions of what schools actually can do, because I think that's the hard part. He continues to speak at organizations, parents, and legislators about the importance of the reduced use of or elimination of restraint and seclusion. And anyone that knows this trauma-informed work knows who Guy Stevens is and his heart for helping school systems get it right and make sure each student feels welcome, safe, and loved each day. So, Guy, welcome to our podcast, and then help me fill in the blanks of what I've missed.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I appreciate your introduction, and very thoughtful. It's actually nice to have an introduction that isn't just the same thing that I handed over to somebody, right? Here's my introduction. You can read that. It's always great. So I appreciate that. I am really excited to be here and always excited to have an opportunity to try to further this work, right? The reason we do these things is to kind of share ideas and collaborate and get ideas out there and hopefully influence change that ultimately has, a couple of goals, but one is to improve outcomes for our kids, and other is to improve outcomes for teachers and staff. And I happen to be a firm believer that you can actually do all of that at the same time, that the same things that will improve things for our children can actually improve things for teachers and staff and others as well. So I don't think you really missed anything in the intro. I'm sure I could say other things, but that was a good overview, and I'm happy to tell you more about my story as well. But that's great.
Yeah. So how did you kind of get started with all this? And I know, again, Katie kind of briefly mentioned, maybe give us the not full life story version, but how did you kind of get started with all this? What catapulted you into this work?
And I appreciate that you knew to put guardrails up for me, or I would go way off, which is easy to do. But I'll give you kind of an abbreviated version. So if you went back, 6 years ago, this was not my direction. This was not my career. This was not what I was passionate about. I worked for a university. I'd been working there I've been in the same job for over 20 years. I worked in the environmental field. Of course, I was a father as well. And I guess as well is probably not the best way to put it. I've always felt that, being a parent is probably our most important role here in terms of, being on the planet and trying to do great things. But of course, have had two kids, and my kids were my world. Unfortunately, I had an experience where my neurodivergent son was being physically restrained and secluded at school. There was a time that if you had brought up the idea of restraint and seclusion in the context of a school, I probably would have looked at you in disbelief. I don't know that they were things that I would have imagined happened at schools, and certainly not things that I would have imagined were more likely to happen to kids with disabilities. And unfortunately, we had a personal experience, and it happened a few times. The very last time it happened was about a little over 5 years ago, in the fall of 2018. My son was restrained and secluded, traumatized by the impact of it. And this, had led me to, a couple of things, I guess, somewhat of an unexpected journey. I talked to my son about kind of what had happened and what had been done to him. And, he had a couple of experiences over his academic career. At this point, he was actually in middle school, and, it wasn't the first time it had happened, but he had actually been out of school for the preceding 2 years, because at the end of 5th grade, he was physically restrained and secluded, and it led him to a situation where he was afraid to go back to school. After a lot of soul searching, we homeschooled him for the next 2 years, not because we had some dream of being homeschool teachers or we thought we could do a better job, but quite frankly, the trauma had really impacted him, and we thought it was the best thing to do. So we returned to school in the fall of 2018, only to have this happen to him again. And at that point, I began to try to understand what these things were, why they were happening. I talked to my son. What I knew even fairly quickly was that my son was restrained and secluded in a way that wasn't even consistent with what our state law said around the use of restraint and seclusion. Our state law was, and still is, one of the better state laws in the nation around restraint and seclusion. And it had a very high bar on terms of when you might use a physical restraint or seclusion. And the bar was, it was a crisis situation. You've tried all else, and it's needed to avoid imminent serious physical harm to that child or someone else. And, that wasn't the situation. My son once was restrained and secluded for splashing water, once for throwing a book, not even at anyone, just kind of throwing a book. So I had a conversation with my son about what had happened. And, I said, look, what was done to you shouldn't have been done to you. This is not okay. And I made him a promise, and the promise was really simple. The promise was, I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that this doesn't happen to you again or other kids like you. So that was in the fall of 2018, and that followed, kind of following that, I began to dive in and do a lot of research. I kind of came from a science background, so research was kind of like, okay, well, let's look into this. And I wanted to know kind of why these things were happening, who they were happening to. Ultimately, I wanted to know what we could do differently. But that was really what led to the start of this. And of course, 6 years ago, 5.5 years ago, as I mentioned, I had a different full-time job. I was in my, I guess, upper 40s at that point. No intent of any kind of career change or turning my life in a different direction. But, started this research, and in the spring of 2019, started the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, because what I was beginning to learn led me down a journey of thinking, like, we've got to change something. This doesn't sound like something should be happening. And from there, eventually, and I'll kind of wrap this up, but, the Alliance was formed, and we began doing our work. And ultimately, I ended up making a decision, which probably didn't make a lot of sense. But, when I started the Alliance, it was out of passion. And, suddenly, though, I found myself in a situation where I had essentially 2 full-time jobs. The Alliance had grown into a full-time job, and I had a full-time job. And eventually I reached a point where I'm like, that probably doesn't work. Because of course, I got into this for a reason, and I didn't want to lose sight of the fact that my family was really important to me as well. And having 2 full-time jobs wasn't necessarily something I could do. And I made a really strange decision. Of course, at the time, the Alliance was kind of a grassroots organization. We weren't funded, and my mortgage was paid by my primary job. And, I kind of realized that, okay, well, I had to stop doing something. Logically, I would have said, okay, well, I have to stop doing what I'm doing with the Alliance. I can't do it. And contrary to that, I thought, this work's too important. I can't give it up. And even though I had no idea how I was going to make it work, I made a decision to leave my job and focus on this work full time to try to bring about change. So that's the short version of the story. There are much longer versions, and anyway, it really came out of personal experience, and then kind of an awakening, following some research, and then this idea that we've got to change something.
Yeah, it's not easy to do either. Like, I know, like, making any kind of change like that, like you said, it's kind of a leap, right? And when you have all those personal factors, like you said, that's the short version. The long version is years worth of thinking and trying to figure out what's best and things like that. That's not easy. So you mentioned that reform was needed, change was needed. In all of your looking at restraint, seclusion, just how schools are run in general, things like that, what was it that you came across that led you to believe, like, hey, there is a change that needs to happen? Like, why is there the change in discipline that needs to happen?
So, we started very much focused around restraint seclusion in schools, because that's where the experience started.
Mm-hmm.
But the deeper I started diving into this, the more I understood, kind of who was impacted, what the impact was. that led me to kind of like this idea of like, what do we do differently? And my work started very locally. I started with our school district, began writing letters to the Board of Education, reaching out to the superintendent, reaching out to local organizations for help and support to say, hey, these things are happening. We should do something different. Eventually, I was able to get the attention of the school board and the superintendent. Although this was not easy, I'm going to tell you like a 2-second story that could be very long. But eventually, under kind of pressure of the Board of Education, the superintendent agreed to form a committee, invited me to join it. We began looking at restraint seclusion issues in our district. Turns out that our district was #1 in the state in the use of seclusion, #2 in the state in the use of restraint. They were doing these things at a far higher rate than anyone else in the state. And of course, that should lead to a lot of questions, but that led us ultimately to changing the policy and changing the practice. And when I first started this, I began doing research. I began looking at data, primary scientific literature, news stories, anything I could find. And I began to kind of compile that. I had this big set of notes. And, as I began to go into those meetings where we met with the school district, I remember very early on, somebody said, well, what do we do instead? And there was one time that I didn't have an answer to that question, but I assure you the next time somebody asked me that question, I did. And that's really where I began to focus. Of course, when you start with something like this, you focus on the problem. And very quickly, what I began to realize was the focus really needed to be on the solution. And, in terms of, solutions, I began looking at like, what are things that people are doing to reduce and eliminate restraint seclusion? What are approaches that are better approaches to help them move in a better direction? Initially, the work that I found and the connections that I began making, led me to work from people like Dr. Ross Green. I found a program called CARU, which is a trauma-informed alternative to restraint seclusion. Those two programs, we actually introduced them to the district. And the year that this happened to my son, they had about 750 seclusions, over 500 restraints. If you look at the last year data, they had no seclusions, and I think they had about a dozen restraints. So over time, they were really able to kind of change what they were doing and make a difference. But really, where I'm interested in moving is kind of that higher level. So, again, focus started on restraint seclusion, but that's not where it ends. It's restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. In a broader sense, it's really, you framed a question about discipline. And what I would say, it's really, even above discipline, it's kind of about all the things that we do to kids very often in the name of behavior. And if we take a step up and look at the kids that we're talking about, when we're talking about disproportionate discipline, when we're talking about the kids that are most often on the other side of all of these things, we're talking about children with disabilities, Black and brown children, kids with a trauma history, and in some cases, restraint and seclusion is one, very young children, 5, 6, 7 years old. So that, of course, leads you to this idea that, well, gee, why? Why is this happening? And I'll tell you that when I first started this, something had been done to my son. I was angry. I was upset. I wanted to change things, right? I wasn't necessarily initially very empathetic towards the educators that had done this to my child, right? I was like angry.
Sure.
But very quickly that started to shift, because what I realized, and I certainly subscribe to ideology like kids do well if they can, and I think the same holds true of adults. But the question then is, how do you change the system to help everyone to do well? So when it comes to that higher level, I think there's a lot of things that need to happen. But again, it's not just about the discipline. It's very often about the things that we're doing in the name of behavior. And what I would say, in my experience and opinion, a lot of what we're doing in the name of behavior isn't working for the kids that need our help the most. So what's that mean? Well, that means, the kids that we're doing certain things with in the vein of getting them to meet our expectations are not only not working, they're failing and leading to these discipline problems. And I could probably go into a side, pathway about that, but I do think that at a high level, it's a lot of the things that we do related to behavior. It also has something to do with, I think, the way that we think about discipline. I remember reading Dr. Lori Destel's book, Connections Over Compliance, and I'd actually very early in my journey connected with Lori Actually, before that book came out, she had sent me a copy, and I was reading an advanced copy, and I came across a line talking about discipline. And it was kind of this idea that, you know, if you go back to the root word for discipline, it's really about teaching. But very often the ideology out there around discipline is it's about consequences, right? It's about, you know, being accountable. And I'm not trying to suggest that there's no idea of you know, kids understanding their impact or accountability. But if you reframe you know, discipline into the idea of teaching, you know, we've got in many cases very young kids, and part of the job in education, at least this is one of my beliefs, part of the job in education is not just to teach subjects or topics that you became a subject matter expert in, but when we're talking about having young children with brains that are, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, part of the job is raising humans, right? It's nice to compartmentalize and say there's no role in that, but you can't spend that much time during the day with a young human without having some ability to help kind of raise that human. And part of that is kind of reframing discipline and approaching it from a different way. So I hope I, in a long way, kind of got to your question, but you know, I think that there's a lot that needs to change around discipline. I think a lot of it is even upstream of the discipline to what we're doing in the name of behavior. And you know, of course, people have different beliefs, they have different experiences, they have different training. You know, what I would say, and you know, I know there are those that will not agree with me, but a lot of what we do around behavior is from the last century. A lot of what we do around behavior is, you know, our approaches that are 100, 150 years old. A lot of what we do around behavior are things like operant conditioning, rewarding consequence, and quite frankly, a lot of what we're doing around behavior is not working. And often we double down. So when things don't work, we do more of them, and that happens both with the kind of approaches around behavior and the discipline. So kids need more discipline. No, that's not the answer. You know, we need to look at discipline from a different perspective and figure out, you know, how do we support kids? Why are children having the difficulty? And sometimes it's even our expectations, right? Sometimes we need to realign our expectations because they're not even, you know, kind of neurodevelopmentally appropriate for kids. So anyway, I'm going to tie up the answer, but I think that there's a lot that needs to change. If I try to put it in a very, you know, kind of a brief sentence or two, I think a lot of what we need to do is kind of move from behavioral mindsets into leveraging the knowledge that we have from the last couple of decades around the brain, around trauma. You know, you can go back 20 years ago to the ACEs study and what we've learned there. Go back to the 90s as a decade of the brain. We've learned more about behavior in the last 30 years than we've known in all of time before that. Yet, in many places, we're still relying on approaches that are really not working and not effective. So I think a lot needs to be done to kind of change and address the way that we're approaching.
Yeah, I would say just from a school principal lens, I think some of the challenges we face is we know there's disproportionality. We know there's issues with restraint and seclusion. And I think because you think of a behavior in a different mindset, people assume nothing's being done because natural consequences or the restorative approach or, you know, those kind of things that are happening, people just don't think because if you suspend, we're not actually changing any of the behavior, right? We've just avoided it and they come back, right? So I think there is always some criticism of why is this kid not out? Or, you know, nothing was done. They just, you know, get to go back to class and get the snack. Or, you know what I mean? You hear those things all the time. Yeah. And so I think that education piece of like, there are things that we're doing. We're putting natural consequences in place. There is some ownership with the restorative piece for the student, and we're making proactive plans to do some preventative work and really meeting the kids where they are. That's a hard lens shift for some people. And I think also because we're trying to keep everything very confidential, where if you are not involved, you don't need to know, and that people have a hard time with that. Because you think about old policies where we're like publicly stoning or, you know what I mean, where everybody got to see what was going on. It's just it's hard when it's like none of your business sometimes,
I've absolutely
you know?
heard that as well. And I get it. And that's why I think that, you know, if we think about the changes that really need to happen, the changes are not just about the kids. A lot of the changes that need to happen. And of course, I'm talking to two people that get this probably, you know, better than anyone, right? But the changes that need to happen are within us. And part of it is, just a very simple thing. One simple thing that I think can change everything is when you begin to understand that not all behavior is intentional. When you begin to understand the difference between what we kind of call a bottom up or a body up behavior and a top down behavior, and as we look at, brain development, we look at kids, and if we begin to look at things through that lens of, oh gosh, not all behavior is in fact, intent. A lot of behavior that we're talking about is, well, I like to say, and I'm quoting giants, but I like to say behavior is biology. Stuart Schenker, who wrote a fantastic book called Self-Reg, says that frequently. People say behavior is communication. Yeah, check. Okay, that's fine. But really fundamentally above that, it's biology. And then you can look at the work of people like Dr. Stephen Porges and the polyvagal theory, and you begin to understand that our brain and body and nervous system was created for survival. Okay. And that brain and body and nervous system that was created for survival, if we sense something that may feel to us unsafe, if we don't feel safe in an environment, we are more apt to have a distress related behavior. And people often look at any behavior as being intentional and then want to change the behavior. So what are we going to do? We assume it's intentional, then we try to reward it out of a kid, we try to consequence it out of a kid. But oftentimes it's skills, it's abilities, it's sensitivities to sensory sensitivities. There's so many things beneath the surface that can contribute to behavior. And if our approach is kind of a consequence driven approach, what we end up doing often is further traumatizing kids. Punishing a child for a stress response, this is an innate response. This is not a child saying, today I'm going to go in and and I'm not trying to say that there's no intentional or top-down behavior. Of course, there's some intentional top-down behavior. However, when you're working with very young kids, it's probably a lot less than you think it is. But as adults with fully functioning brains, we tend to look at it through the world through that lens. And, I've sat in IEP meetings, you probably have as well, where you've heard children's behavior attributed to, kind of choice, where these children would have had to come up with this very complex plan to manipulate people and do these things. And the staff is telling these stories like, okay, well, this is what they did and this is why they did it. And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm an adult and I don't know that I'd be capable of thinking that up, So we often have that tendency to kind of think about behavior in that very volitional way. And I think, the neuroscience, what we know about trauma, all of those things today should be leading us in a different direction. And of course, when you punish kids for, stress behavior, that punishment itself becomes trauma. And of course, if we go back to the idea of teach, if we truly want to teach, what do we need to teach? We need a regulated brain, right? So of course, Joshua, you did work in the neurosequential model, regulate, relate, reason, right? We can talk about that. But, if we want learning to be available, that prefrontal cortex needs to be available, right? And that prefrontal cortex is not available when I'm dysregulated. And guess what? When you begin to bring all those consequences at me and that punishment at me, you're dysregulating me. I'm not learning a thing. So, I think if we truly want to inform and lead to change, a lot of this gets to reframing the way that we see behavior. And it's not just the behavior of the kids, it's our own behavior. I know you've both been on these journeys in various ways of Dr. Laurie's program and the neurosequential model. But when you begin to become aware yourself of your brain and your body and your nervous system, and understand your own stress responses, because as Dr. Perry would say, and others have said, never in the world will a dysregulated adult help a child who is dysregulated. We need to be kind of co-regulating, not, co-dysregulating kids. So anyway, I don't mean to go on a side, note here, but I think that's so important. I think so much of this is a shift in our mindset around discipline and behavior. And of course, I think there are, you mentioned some approaches. I'm a fan of Joe Brummer's work with trauma-informed restorative approaches. And I think there's a lot of things that we can do. But a lot of this is moving beyond that concept of, okay, action response, that every time a child is having a behavior that we think is undesirable, that we look at it as something to punish out of them. If a kid can't read, what do? We get them a reading intervention, we get them help, we get them support. What we don't do is punish them because they can't read. And we don't offer them incentives to make them read, if they don't have the skill. Okay, we don't say, well, here's a cookie, read the book. If you don't have the skill, that's not going to help you. But we do that with behavior. Very often with behavior, we look at it as it's intentional. You need to make better choices. So here's a consequence, or here's a reward, and that's going to guide it. But looking at work like Dr. Green's work, it's about like, how do we understand the lagging skills and unsolved problems? How might we teach something, or how do we investigate kind of the stress? Dr. Shanker does tremendous work around kind of this idea of self-reg and understanding the impact that stress has. How do we begin to understand what those stressors are and address those as things that might be triggers to a child's nervous system feeling unsafe and then having stress-related behavior?
One of the things that you said that jumped out to me, so much of I've had a lot of opportunities to be able to work with staff specifically, whether it's in my in my current role or previously where I worked. I had a couple of years where specifically I was doing a lot of almost like just support training of staff for a couple of years there. And one thing that I definitely recognize and that we see all over in all kinds of districts, not just where we work now, but and it sounds like something that you probably pretty consistently see as well, is that idea that you brought up where it's about humans are all going through these things, right? And so the adults, the teachers, they're all humans as well, right? We're all humans. And so what struck me, or one of the things that I thought was interesting as you were talking about the kids, we've been doing the same thing potentially that we've done for 100 years or for 50 years or whatever it is in trying to teach and bring kids along in the world of behavior, discipline, all of those things, consequences that are doled out. All of that has been very similar for a long time. And then I think to myself, well, we've also been really training the adults in the same way that we've been training the adults for the last 50, 100 years, whatever it might be, 25, even going 25 years. We've made so much ground up, like you said, in understanding the brain and understanding just people and how people function and work, not just from like a psychological, but from like a biological standpoint. We've understood so much more. And I think we're a little bit behind on our shift. I don't sit here and pretend to like I've got all the answers, but like I do think that we'll hopefully start seeing shifts in how we are, not just like the information we are training adults with, because I think that's hopefully shifting and starting to shift now, but also the way that we're trying to support and train the adults. Because if that's so often what it feels like for teachers. I've learned over the years, and I think Katie, you would second this, or you disagree with me, and just tell me that. But I think what we see is that you're on an island. You feel like you're on an island so frequently, and then all of a sudden something happens that you didn't expect, right? That that makes you feel uncomfortable. And that potentially feels like a very big deal, or even could be a very big deal within the classroom. Your gut reaction right away is, I'm in charge of these 20, 25, 30, whatever it is, kids. This thing is happening. I need this thing to end, is what our bodies start telling us. I need this thing to end right now. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And then you start thinking not like long term, right? All the state dependent functioning stuff that we hear and that we talk about. Now all of a sudden, I'm a human too. I'm thinking now in minutes and seconds instead of thinking, hours ahead of time or days ahead of time. All these things are happening. And I think that one of the things that we really see a lot is that then people make decisions, and then afterwards, right, when things kind of tone down, everybody's a little bit more regulated. I really believe what happens so often, from what I've seen, is that people then feel like they have to almost justify. They have to make it sound like what they did, even if they don't believe what they did was the right thing or made the right choice or whatever else. They feel like they have to like go the extra mile to like justify this was the right thing because it's the decision I made, right?
We see it a lot with vocabulary, like that people are using to like more aggressive vocabulary to make the situation maybe bigger. Instead of a poke, stabs, right? Assaulted, right? We use these really big words, I think, a lot is we're debriefing to be like, I was attacked. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Some of those things. Yeah.
And I think it's not anybody's ill intent. And I think that's the part that gets interesting for me. It's really interesting because I think I've never met a teacher that got into teaching and was like, you know what, I want to be a real nightmare for people. Like, I really want to be the worst. Like, nobody says that. People come in and they really want to do well, and they really want to help kids, and they want to help kids grow, and they want to be there, and they want to, all the great things that teachers get into teaching for. And then all of a sudden they're in these tough spots, and sometimes they make tough decisions.
Or bottom up, right? So, I mean, some of those are,
yes,
a teacher in that situation doesn't feel safe. There's a stress response. And I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen that become, again, stress response, prefrontal cortex going offline, we're reacting, we're responding. This is a stress response. And of course, you mentioned, when we don't feel safe, and when we feel stressed, of course, we're more likely to go a direction that we know, that we've done 100 times. Even if it's something that doesn't work, it just kind of where our brain goes. Our brain goes, okay, here's a solution. We're going to take it. I think one of the really critical things here, and I believe this wholeheartedly, is that the changes that need to be made need to happen throughout the entire system, right? So, for example, the idea of trauma-informed approaches. Trauma-informed became a huge buzzword, right? And of course, I believe in kind of trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, all of that. But being a trauma-informed school doesn't mean we took a half-day PD and now we're trauma-informed. It also doesn't mean you are going to apply these approaches to kids only. If you're going to be trauma-informed, it is throughout the fabric of the organization. You need to be trauma-informed towards your educators who have experienced, not only personal trauma, but have had trauma within the classrooms and continue to have difficulty. We believe, I mean, the run-on sentence that I always use about, like, well, what's the solution? At the high level, we say it's about being trauma-informed, understanding the impact of trauma, how trauma changes our brain. And, of course, we mean that literally. There are changes that happen in our brain in response to trauma. It's that neuroscience aligned idea. How do we align our approach with kind of what we know about the brain, what we know about human behavior? It's relationship driven. Relationships are so critical to all of this. And again, all of these things are both for the kids, the teachers, hey, guess what, the families too. And then it's being collaborative. How do we move away from doing things to people, or even doing things for people, to doing things with people? So, I believe this kind of trauma-informed, neuroscience-aligned, relationship-driven, and collaborative approach is something we've got to really try to shape into the entire institution. And again, you can't just do these things. Oh, okay, we're gonna be trauma-informed for these kids, but teachers, forget about you. You're adults.
Yeah.
Right. No. And you look at the world and where we are, and of course, having returned to school after COVID, and the whole world went through this global trauma, right? I think, and probably I remember Dr. Lori talking about this quite a bit, and you may remember some of this as well. But kind of even before kids were back in school, going, it's going to be tough, because we have a lot of people that have gone through trauma, and kind of the sense of safety, the connection, all of those things are going to be different. And guess what? Those things didn't just affect our kids; they affected everybody there. So I mean, I'm very much with you that, and that so much of this is not just about, well, how do we do things differently for kids, or no, this is about the teachers, the staff, everyone, and kind of creating a better environment.
Yeah. And it really, I think with organizations and like systematic approach is really prioritizing professional development, just like we do with, the science of reading, right? We spend 40 hours a week training teachers in that. We're seeing huge improvements in reading. We train people with 40 hours of math, but then we don't do any professional development, or very little surrounding behavior, human development, updating, those kind of things. And so I think, I don't know if you agree, Guy, but I really feel like if the state legislations and districts can get on board about prioritizing that whole child approach and really creating mandatory or systematic professional development surrounding all this work, I think, and with some guides along the way, right? We need some coaching and checking in and those kind of things. I think that's really where systems need to start changing, is getting people professional development that's actually going to support them from the ground and get them going in the right direction.
That's a great thought, and as you're saying that, I'm thinking, hey, we should partner in Ohio and see if we can
Yeah,
get
let's do
a
it.
model law passed there. I mean, a lot of we talk about things that lag, right? Higher ed, higher ed is lagging. We're not teaching so much of this that we know today in our higher ed institutions, and there's potential to do that, but it's not happening. So we look at the laws and policies; those things are lagging. We have a lot of things that are specifying things like positive behavior supports and interventions, right? But we don't have, kind of and we've tried to change this where we can, but kind of trauma informed and neuroscience aligned and things like that into our laws. So absolutely, I'm a huge believer in the solutions are upstream, right? And when we look at school discipline as an example, and look at restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, I love the quote, and kind of the idea of, rather than pulling people out of the river, let's go upstream and figure out why they're falling in. And that's where we need to focus a lot of our efforts is what can we do upstream? And I think the education piece is upstream. You're both coming from a place that I can be pretty confident is fairly aligned with a lot of these ideas, but in many places, neuroscience, trauma informed, it's not there. And there's a lot that has to change to get that into, for teachers. Again, back to the idea, kids do well if they can, teachers do well if they can. If you're not being introduced to this information and, you land as a first year teacher in a school that has a very punitive culture, very punitive approach, unfortunately, well, probably another topic, but very often you get in that situation, and it might not feel right to you, but that's what you're being told to do by people that are in authority, and you just kind of begin to do those things, and even though they might not feel right or might instinctually go against what you think, that's kind of where you might end up going, and that's what we see is that. If you look at, why does one school do certain things much more than another? It's culture, it's training, it's kind of the way things are being done there. And those things can be changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the a thing we hear from adults again all over and teachers all over, and I think it's a legitimate question that they have. I don't think people are trying to be difficult or anything like that, but I think that there's a concern for all the kids, right? All the kids, and then you maybe run into a student that has had a really traumatic past, that has a lot of tough reactions to things, very easily dysregulated. Maybe their baseline is almost dysregulated, right? And now all of a sudden, the students in your class. And what we hear a lot is like, well, what about, I've got to be concerned about the other 20 students as well. What about the other students? And again, I don't think that's ever from most of the time. I don't think that's really from like a negative place, but I do think it's out of like genuine curiosity and concern for others. How do you what's your thought on that? Like, what about the other students? I know Katie and I have talked about it before, but I'd be curious to hear where you come from with that.
I'll start off by saying that as a parent, I was a parent to both of those concerns, meaning that my son was the one that was struggling and was having big behaviors and was causing some disruptions. And my daughter, at one point, had a classmate that was having having big disruptions and getting very dysregulated. And so I remember as a parent kind of being on both sides of that. Of course, because of my previous experience, I had a little bit of empathy that I might not have had otherwise, because it's very easy to be like, it's not in my backyard, right? Not in my kid's class, and it's interesting because what you see is this idea that, well, these kids don't belong here. These kids need to go somewhere else. First of all, of course, the law says that they do have a right to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive setting. That said, that process can be slow and cumbersome. So we end up with a lot of very young children who are, often kids that have had a trauma background, often kids with disability who are having a difficult time, who are languishing for a year or so or longer while the wheels of process kind of take place, and maybe something's done. When I see a kid that's being restrained and secluded, what I often see is a kid that's not having their needs appropriately met. That's really what's below the surface here. So what about the other kids? Absolutely. I mean, yeah, all kids, we want them to have the right to go to a safe classroom and learn. When there's a kid that's having a difficult time and having big behaviors, maybe causing a room clear, that can be upsetting, right? I mean, that can be very upsetting. What I would say is that if that's happening repeatedly, that's a failure, right? Happens once, a kid becomes dysregulated, a room clear happens. But if we find we're clearing the same room 5 days a week, what do we need to do differently, and how do we expedite that process? And again, I understand it's really difficult, and there's also limited resources. But of course, we want all of our children to have a safe learning environment. We want our educators to have a safe learning environment. But the what about the other kids, I think, goes in a couple different directions. One is, what does it say to the other kids when our response to a child who becomes dysregulated because they have suffered a tremendous amount of trauma or are wired differently, when the response to that young person is to be physically restrained or secluded? What does that say to the other kids when they see the young disabled Black student being physically held down to the ground or drug out to a seclusion room? What does it say to the other kids when we approach someone who is different than us or having a difficult time with empathy? What does it say? I mean, so there's a lot here. I mean, yes, absolutely. We want to do all that we can to create, safe and stable learning environments. But there are some opportunities, even when kids are very young, to teach some valuable lessons about, how we approach, people that, neurodivergent individuals, people with disabilities, people that may have experienced a lot of trauma. And our response to those situations will make an impression on all the other kids far more than a lot of people may give credit to. So I think there's a bit of a balance, and it certainly is difficult, because I know firsthand the process doesn't move quickly. But, again, when I see a kid that's having a big behavior, I know that this is a kid who is often dysregulated, a kid that often has a trauma history. And we can't just, look for the blame and the shame and well, it's the parents' fault. We only have a kid a few hours a day. What do you expect us to do? One person, one educator that just cares, persists, and tries can make such a difference in that young person's life and get them moving in a better direction. So, this is about balance. And I'm sure, I mean, here I am talking to two people that are far smarter than I am and have far more experience than I do in all of this, and have dealt with many situations that I assure you are extremely difficult. But the hope here, and one of the things I always say in all of the talks that I do in terms of like what drives this, is the Maya Angelou quote, right? It's about do the best we can until we know better, and when we know better, do better. The ask here is that this is a journey where we're trying to know better. So there's a kid that's struggling, that's having big behavior, that's caused a disruption. How do we then begin to inform knowing better supporting that kid, better supporting the other kids in the classroom as well? So not an easy situation. But again, remember when you say, what about the other kids? There's a lot of other opportunities here to show them very positive things. And again, your response can show negative things. What's it demonstrate when a show of force is what we're doing to an individual that becomes dysregulated? We see situations where, if I look at the instances of kids being physically restrained or secluded, what federal guidance says around that is kind of what my state law says, is that you don't do it unless it's a crisis situation. You've tried everything else you can try, and it's needed to avoid imminent serious physical harm. Imminent serious physical harm to the student or someone else. And that phrase, imminent serious physical harm, is a really high bar. It's a potentially life-threatening situation. But what we know is that in practice, that kids are restrained and secluded for non-compliance, for minor behaviors, for disrespect. Kids are restrained and secluded because the adult also becomes dysregulated. And when they become dysregulated, instead of becoming co-regulators, they're co-dysregulating. And, we go from a situation where it's failure to comply with something, failure to do a worksheet, to suddenly we're going to a physical restraint. So there is so much better we can do in many ways for all of the children, whether it be, the other kids or the child that's having a difficult time. And I think as a society, we need to be more empathetic as well. I'll tell you, there's often, I don't know what people think when they think, well, that child doesn't belong there. Where do they belong? And there are people that, well, they should be in a juvenile detention. I mean, we know the outcomes of all these things. We can do things that make a positive difference. The same kids that are restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, subjected to corporal punishment, these are the same kids that become disengaged. These are the same kids that will be more likely to drop out, the same kids that will be more likely to get involved with drugs and alcohol, same kids that will be more likely to end up down the school to prison pipeline. These are avoidable outcomes. If we're working upstream, we can do a lot to avoid getting there. So, and in many of these situations, the other kid's arguments come with kids that are really, 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 really young. There's a lot that we can do to better support the teachers and the kids in those situations.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the way, right? That's our first step. I think it's probably our best way of trying to build a more empathetic just country, I guess, in general, world, right? If you want to go that big, but is to start off by modeling that empathy and modeling that, kind of empathetic response towards people. And then kids are going to, like you pointed out, kids are going to grow up modeling and doing the things that were modeled for them. And if we can be that, then I think that's a pretty big deal. And I think that hopefully helps. It's a long game, right? It's not a quick fix. Nothing's a quick fix, but it is a long game. And I think that makes a huge difference. Hopefully, in 15, 20 years, we start seeing way more empathetic responses to people, but because you're right. Like we've heard that exact phrase. Well, they shouldn't be here. And you're like, well, where should they be? It doesn't matter. They shouldn't be here. And you're like, well, I mean, that doesn't, that's not really a solution. Like, that doesn't really help.
Where do you want them to go?
Yeah.
Let's create some solutions. But
people have a hard time with that.
What do we know about kids that are having a hard time? Of course, what federal law says is we want to try to support all children with disabilities in their least restrictive setting. And of course, inclusion, I believe inclusion is important, and I think it's a great thing. I realize that there are challenges that come along, but those are challenges we need to rise and we need to meet. But kids that are having more of these punitive things done to them end up in more restrictive settings. So they go to a segregated classroom, they go to a behavioral classroom, and often they're getting much more of the same that wasn't working for them in those contexts, and things are growing, the behavior is getting bigger. There's so much that we can stem when kids are younger, that there's a lot of opportunity, I guess, there. And also, I think, just to hit on your point, you mentioned about kind of changing the world, and I actually share some of your big thinking ideas here. Dr. Stephen Porges, the innovator of the polyvagal theory, one of the things he says is, you want to create a better world, you start by making people feel safe. And safety is at the root of so much of this, because again, our brains being wired for survival. When we don't feel safe, when we feel dysregulated, that's when we're all likely to have stress behavior. That's the kids, that's the teachers and staff. Again, think about distress behavior coming from a teacher or a staff member. What's that signaling to you? I don't feel safe. And that's something we've got to focus on as well. And, a child that's having big outbursts in a classroom, that affects a teacher feeling that way as well. So, there's a lot of work to be done, but I happen to agree with you that in the long term, at least I'm hopeful that these are changes that can actually make a positive dent in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, before we wrap up, we'll kind of see what we want people. We kind of tend to end the podcast asking what you want people to walk away knowing. If there's like one thing from this, what you want to have people walk away knowing. Before we do that, though, if there are people that want to kind of get involved or learn more about your organization, how can they do that or support your work, things like that? What could they do?
So always, we can come to our website, which is endseclusion.org, endseclusion.org. We're on most of the social media platforms as well, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, you name it. So those are great places. Of course, people can always reach out to me directly, Guy Stevens at endseclusion.org. Always happy to have people reach out directly if they want to connect or want to chat. And I like the opportunity to connect with people that are doing this work and, those that are struggling and trying to find solutions and figuring out how we can work together to hopefully make a positive difference.
Excellent. Excellent. We'll let you go last. Does that work? That way it gives you a chance to think. All right. So, so Katie, what would you want people to walk away from this episode knowing?
I think I want people to walk away knowing that there is other options and that there is information out there. And I am a strong believer if we can get professional development in the hands of parents and educators, we're going to change outcomes for kids. I think that is really a big part of the solution is just, and being willing to have conversations about it too. I think it's a lot of avoiding sometimes of talking about the hard things and really getting some systems in place. And really it's reformatting some of our educational systems to put different supports because we have different needs now and prioritizing some of that. So I hope people walk away knowing that there are other options and there are better ways to help and support kids and that we can change educational outcomes if we can commit to or being willing to take the risk to do it.
That's good. I think for me, one of the things that I would hope people walk away knowing wherever you're listening from, we tend to hyper focus, right? As teachers, we talk about this a lot. Like, well, my world is my classroom. Whatever's happening in my classroom is happening. Like that's how the whole world feels, right? Because we're so invested in it. And then whatever, maybe even you can stretch out something like, well, whatever's happening in my building is how the whole world feels. We're the only ones. And then you start to realize, hopefully what people can walk away knowing is that this is not wherever you're at only kind of issue that we're up against, right? I think this is widespread, and I think that hopefully isn't discouraging. Hopefully that's encouraging to know that you're not alone, you're not on an island, that you've got people around and you've got resources, hopefully in your area, but if not in your area, certainly that are around that nationwide, right? That people can reach out and find and get help from and get more information from. Do that. Reach out, and then I would also encourage people to start, right? If you don't start, sometimes I'm a slow starter. Katie, it's one of Katie's favorite things about me. I'm a slow starter. But if you don't start, then you're never going to actually be able to make changes or adjustments that need to be changed or be made so that you can help out kids and help out the staff that are working with kids as well. So be brave enough to start, even if you don't know all of the answers yet, because I think hopefully what you heard from Guy, hopefully what you hear from us all the time is like, we certainly don't have all the answers. We certainly haven't arrived like we're the pinnacle of what it is. Understand that you've got to start and you got to keep getting better. And again, doing better as you know better. All right, you're up, Guy. Beat both of ours.
All right. So I'll start with a thank you. And my thank you is intended for all the teachers and educators out there. I mean, this is a difficult job. It's an important job. It's gotten more and more challenging over time for lots of reasons. But I think that people who have decided to go into education, by and large, are people that want to make a positive impact, that want to help kids, that want to do things to make a better world. So I want to begin with a thank you, and I guess from there, share that I'm hopeful. Sometimes this all seems really overwhelming. And I'm sure that, a lot of the people in your audience can think about a day ending in their classroom and probably ending their day feeling in tears, just feeling like, this is not, some things are not working. But, I have a lot of hope around this. And I think that, there's a lot of amazing people out there doing some incredible work to try to bring about positive change. There are opportunities out there right now. I know you both have different backgrounds in terms of training with the sequential model and the applied educational neuroscience approach, but there are programs out there where educators can not only learn, I think, a lot of things that can be transformative, but connect and find communities of like-minded people. Because when you feel like you're alone on that island, and I know plenty of educators that are the change makers within their organizations. And that's not easy. It's not easy to be a change maker within your organization. But I think that would be the last thing that I would want to leave people with is don't be afraid to be that change maker. And, even though it may not be easy, we often talk about kind of within a community of people that are doing this work about the importance of kind of disrupting systems that aren't working. So I think that when you have that knowledge and you begin to understand that things aren't working, get curious, follow it, learn more, sign up for a class, take a program. I think we can do better. We can do better for kids. We can do better for teachers and staff. We can reduce and eliminate certain types of punitive discipline that aren't working for us. And if you want any evidence of that, look at the fact that we incarcerate more people in this country than anywhere else in the world. What we're doing here is not working. We need to do something better. And those better things we can do will not only improve outcomes for kids, they'll improve outcomes for you. And I think they'll ultimately lead to a better world. But it takes time. But it's got to start, right? So those would be my final words.
Well, thank you so much, Guy. We appreciate having you on. And thank you all for listening. Man, share this with colleagues, share this with friends. If you're a parent out there, we know that we have parents out there that listen as well that aren't in education. Share this with your kids' teachers or principals. Go ahead and spread the word. This is a great one. And again, Guy Stevens, just his work, so impactful and a lot to be learned from him and all that he's done for sure. And so thank you. Share this and let's go out there and keep doing the work.
Yeah, let's go do the work. Thank you, Guy. Appreciate it.
Much appreciate the opportunity.
Hey everybody, let's keep the conversation going.
Like and subscribe below and keep the comments rolling.